All Eyes on Fishing with Mitch Peterson, Josh Sheldon, and Brad Qualley, leading you to the next level.
Hey everybody, welcome back to All Eyes on Fishing. Tonight we're going to be talking about big bait versus little bait, and you guys want to talk about like live bait and
I think
whatever.
All baits.
All baits. I think
whatever.
artificial and live.
Sure.
So this came in from a question that somebody had talking about, hey, what size bait should you be using during the spring, fall, winter? He was asking a bunch of questions, and we responded back, but we figured why not? Let's talk about it because there's other people that have this same question. So let's talk about live bait first.
Yeah, I mean, we can go, well, I mean.
Just whatever.
Yeah, whatever. I mean, I think, like the old adage, right? Size matters. I think size can be all that matters at certain times of the year.
Yeah, I think so too. Everybody says, use big baits to catch bigger fish. Well, to some extent, yeah, it might single out just larger
bigger fish, yeah.
that are going to go after a bigger bait like that. But, I think we've all seen plenty of examples of, big fish getting caught on pretty small baits.
Yeah, and there's a certain amount of finesse during different times of the year. I would guess that this time of year with there being through the ice, it's, some of the smaller baits, the more of a finesse approach. It could be a lot more productive than a gigantic bait or a big
perfect
big
example.
spoon.
We were on the ice last weekend, and we had a couple trout coming. I was fishing a really small micro jig, and I was catching, I don't know, whether like 14-inch trout.
Yeah,
but a couple nice ones came in, and Mitch was using
I had a big blade bait, 2 giant treble hooks on it, and really, I was jigging that to bring in pike for our tip-ups.
Right.
In Brad's hole, he had his little micro jig. I don't know what he was doing where his jig was out of the hole right then, but I looked down the hole, and here's these 2. They were 20-plus, no problem, rainbows.
Yeah.
And they were swarming all over my bait, but I could just tell by looking at them, they didn't want to have anything to do with it. And off they went, disappeared. Yeah. But I promise you, I've seen many times that same scenario where I do have the right size jig on, and they're taking it. They're not even thinking twice about it. So right there, sure. Bigger baits weren't going to catch the bigger fish.
Right.
It was too much, and I think that's the thing that goes into kind of all ice fishing in general. Fish can be aggressive, but overall with the colder water temps, slower metabolism, they are just a little slower, a little more finicky, and I think a smaller bait a lot of times will trigger them versus something too big.
Yeah. No, I think when you get into those big aggressive feeding times like spring where they're coming off of the ice fishing and they're open water's just coming out, and we all know they're coming off the spawn.
Are you talking walleyes?
I'm talking all of them. I'm talking bass, walleye, whatever. Of course, bass are different because they sit on beds and stuff like that, and the walleyes will go up the river. Or
You're talking that time period.
I'm talking the time period post-spawn where they put on the feed bag.
Big baits.
That's when you go with the big baits to get the bigger fish. I think that's more of a time when you're going to do that. Or fall when it starts to get to later
you're
on.
You're going to be using those 11s, 12s.
And they're starting to set up on a little bit deeper structure. You're going to start to use those baits that are bigger, and when they come up at night, like we've talked about several times in the past, and they come up to feed and they're up higher in the water column for a short period of time feeding, you're going to use those bigger baits. And I think it's that way with northerns too. I think pike do the same thing. You use the bigger stick baits or the bigger buzz baits or spinner baits or whatever you're using for the pike at that point, bigger jigs in those earlier times right after the spawn, and then everybody kind of starts to pare it down to a little bit smaller size to be a little more consistent. But I also think that's why you get those smaller fish then. Mm-hmm. You consistently catch more fish. I mean, we'll have days where you catch 50 walleye, no problem, but they're all between, 17 inches to 18 inches, whatever. Where in the springtime, you use those bigger baits, we may catch more fish consistently, 20, 23, 24 inches.
Yeah, I've kind of got a theory as far as crankbaits go, kind of spring through summer. In the springtime, pretty much all the bait fish. So a lot of our reservoirs, it's shad. That's the main forage, and gizzard shad. Well, all the gizzard shad that are in the water, say in March in the reservoir, they're all pushing
big.
Adult size,
They're
right?
big.
Yeah, they're full size.
Yep.
They're not the
about
babies
the size of a 7 or a 9.
Bigger than that even.
Well, some from the year before, but I mean the ones from the last spawn, in the reservoir are usually right around
Right,
that.
so you're talking the big population
Yeah.
of bait fish. Well, so early spring, should you be using a little bit bigger flicker shad, the 7 or
Right.
9, like you say? And then once that hatch happens, there's tons of shad in the water, but they're too small. A lot of game fish,
Right.
it's not worth their time. They're too small. So that's when, a lot of times the Lindy rig and crawlers and leeches and the invertebrates, a lot of the predators switch over to that forage.
Crayfish.
And that, and
Two
that's why,
jigs, yeah.
why that bite gets so hot. But then, later in summer, we'll run 5s or so, like in June, we'll say.
Right.
Brad and I love to run 5s where you usually do go a
7s.
little bigger.
Yeah.
By July into August, you bet we're going 7s and 9s ourselves because, again, that spring
It's
of the
kind of
year
like the
hatch.
fly fishermen with matching the hatch.
Totally.
Yes and no. I think that's the big difference. I think that's the difference in our philosophies.
It's not the hatch, but it's what the primary bait fish, the size would be.
I think
And a little
it's-
bit of a separator.
Actually, I think it's the opposite. I think instead of matching it, I think they take the oddball. We all have seen where we fish our reservoirs early spring with 4s and 5s and do really well. We know those. We can see them. I mean, a lot of times we see the schools of them. They'll come up and you'll see them on the surface, and we know those are size 7 or bigger. But when we fish the oddball size, the 5, the 4, it's like the fish key in on them. It's different than that. You get in, you roll through that school, you pull through that school, and you have the oddball size or the oddball, little bit different that might key that fish. In the summertime, it's just the opposite. I think, you got those little ones. Well, you throw on those 7s, and it's that one that's just a little bigger. It's different. It's different than the rest of them, and that's my
Well,
theory.
I think your theory is probably pretty right on because it goes right into not just the size, but the action or maybe where that
Rattles or no rattles?
Yeah,
or-
if you pull your cranks through say a school of shad,
Right.
and yours is kind of off on its own, or going into the school and then out again.
Right.
Yeah, it's singled out, it's by itself. So you bet. I think you're probably onto that.
I think it's more of that. When we fish balls, I mean, I agree with you, but I also think that when you're fishing balls of bait fish, that a lot of your strikes are coming, if you're fishing just below the ball of bait fish or just outside of it, going right through the middle of it, now you're competing with thousands.
Right, but it's the different
Until
size.
it busts out of the school.
Until it busts out, right.
Hey, 6 minutes and 57 seconds. I want it to be noted. Brad agreed with me. That's how far we were into this podcast.
Well, you know what? It's funny you said that.
6:57.
Because,
Mitch.
because here's the thing. When you were talking, I was like, I am actually agreeing with you. This is like a first because
And I've thought about it a lot, and we've talked about it as a group. We'll be out there fishing, and especially on those days when you're not catching fish, you start to talk about it more. But I think that's, we do have a few lakes that have the absolute best walleye bait in the world, rainbow smelt. And a couple, when we fish those, we use fairly good size. I mean, obviously the bait is a much narrower, longer type of bait as opposed to shad.
we'll go a little bigger in the rainbow.
But when we're targeting walleyes that are used to suspending for smelt, it's that's what we commonly go with, the bigger, longer baits. And it really gets interesting when because we have a lake here or a reservoir here that has both a huge smelt and a huge shad population. Now, we're always changing it up, right? We have
You
two of
can't-
the four
problem with
rods
that
and
is we
flicker
get
shads
confused.
and-
We're all confused. We're like, I don't know what to use.
well, which one did that one have it on, or whatever. But that is the fun part is, when you get a population that's got a lot of bait and they suspend and they ravage it, I'm sure Erie's the same way with their different types of baits. That's why their fish are so gigantic, and that's why they have such a great trolling bite. But I mean, that's the difference when you're talking about baits and cranks and matching the hatch, but not really. I mean,
Yeah, I say that with reservation, matching the hatch. What I'm just saying is being cognizant of what is growing up right now.
right.
Right.
You know what I mean?
What are the fish going after?
Right.
Exactly.
And so now let's flip it over to jigging, okay? And when and let's talk about jigs. Let's talk about plastics versus plastics on a jig head versus a
crawler?
leech or a crawler or a minnow or a sucker or whatever you're going to use, right? Whatever your live bait
Go-to
of
is.
choice is. Because I think there's a definite difference. I mean, I've had tough bites where I typically like to start with 3-inch grubs, go to 4-inch, and then even 5, depending on if we're doing casting. Sometimes the 5s are really good, and we'll get those 24, 25-inch fish that are fairly common at that point, and those 5s are great. That's a quarter-ounce jig head, size 5 twister tail, whatever your favorite brand is. The Berkeley just came out with a new grub that is bigger, fatter, more like the Kalins. So something like that. I like that. But I know a lot of guys who stick to that 1/8 ounce casting or pitching or however you want to describe it. And in the smaller type grubs, the 2.5-inch grubs, and that's all they'll use.
I think that, like, when we go out and we're pitching shorelines, for some reason, and when you were talking, it made me think, I always start off with a 3-inch.
I almost always do
I
as
do,
well.
I
3
do,
or 4.
and it's usually the 3-inch, and if I'm picking fish up, of course, I stay with that. But if not, I'll go up to the 5 and try them back and forth, try some of the glide jigs and stuff to help out with some
little
action.
more action.
Yeah, a little
Right,
more action.
right.
But I think predominantly, if you had, I mean, you gotta have all that in your arsenal to try it.
Sure.
Right? But I think that, and Mitch is probably the same. I think that you probably predominantly put on 3-inch like grubs.
Well, a lot of times, like if Brad and I are fishing together, we do. It's usually we start at 3-inch, but always different colors.
Always different
we
colors.
We change up the colors. Now, if something feels like when we switch out a color, maybe it's that bigger bait. Oh yeah, and that works. Then we're going to try to size
And
up to it.
that's I'm glad you brought that up, because I was thinking that in my head, is that when you are out there with another guy fishing, you're casting a shoreline, don't use the same thing, especially to begin with. Make sure that, I mean, it might be, white always works good, we're using white. Maybe not this day.
Right.
Someone should put on an orange or red or whatever it is.
Right.
And try that and narrow that down, because it might be better that day. And if the white is catching fish, move over to a 5 like a ripple shad or something. Try it, because it might get bigger fish. It might
It
get
just
more
trigger
fish.
more
You
bites.
don't know, and you can narrow it down after about an hour on the water of what's
Sure.
truly working good. I think the problem that I see when I take guys out, they stick to it. That is my bait, and I'm sticking to it.
Because it worked
that's like-
last week.
Yeah.
Or,
Well, fishing a memory. Everybody
Yeah.
gets stuck fishing a memory, whether it's a spot or a jig or
I
whatever.
know. So
but-
if white is working, well, of course you want to continue to use that, but your buddy should be trying something else, or you do it.
Right.
And see if that is actually truly that day is what's working
Right.
good.
Okay. So now I don't. People keep their bait several different ways. No, any one way is right or wrong. Whatever you like to do. Are you the person that digs down through the bucket of leeches, looking for that big fat leech that's going to extend 3-4 inches off of your hook, or are you the guy that goes down and gets that leech that's just the good little medium size? What's your preference, Mitch?
If I'm Lindy rigging, I'm going jumbo.
As big as they go,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I wish they
Okay.
I wish they were a foot long.
Okay.
I'd put it on.
All right. How about you?
Whatever I grab out of there.
Yeah. See, and I'm more. I used to be like that too. I
I'm
used
more
to think
about
the
the
bigger.
presentation.
Well, and I'll tell you what. These walleyes. I think there's two things. I do think the bigger, the more difficult it can be for them to get. I mean, whether it be, especially if you're doing Lindy, right? You have a long leader, light line, maybe it's a hook, no jig head. That that leech could be down there just giving her hell, right?
I think they're slurping it right up.
See, I
not-
think
not
I
like
go a
down
little
here.
bit smaller.
See, I'm not going to agree with you on that.
See, I go a little bit smaller. I think sometimes it's just too much. I think it's too much.
Well,
the
it might
bigger-
be too aggressive or too much movement, but it's not too much.
Well,
for them to
or if
take.
you tip it on a jig, you're using a some sort of whatever your favorite jig is, and you tip it with a leech. I think if you do too much. I think the profile, whatever it is, can turn them off. I think it does. I think sometimes when you put something on there that's a little more subtle, more for the scent, a little bit for the action, I think they're all over it. And I mean, I've just seen it a bunch where it appears that's what they do. Now, when I'm doing slip bobber, I like to get a little bit fatter, a little bit bigger
Why?
because it's hanging down in there. It just seems to be hanging right in their face, and then I've got enough weight on the way I rig my slip bobber to where it keeps it, fairly in line. That thing's not swimming off in different directions. And I think when they extend and then they hit that warmer water, because I keep them on ice, man, it's on. And you throw it out there and it's swimming the second it hits the water.
Well, I'll tell you what, is back in the early 90s in Minnesota, we were
When you were in your
on-
30s?
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
Even 20s.
Yeah.
Well, we were on this every beginning of June. Yeah, everybody knows it back home. When that live bait turns on,
Right.
it's go time, right? Well, first week of June, Lake Independence, right there west of the cities.
Yeah.
And we'd hammer them every year. And it was always with just a hook and a leech, Lindy rig basically,
Yeah.
split shot rig like we've talked about.
Yeah.
Well, funny thing, we'd catch 6, 7 pounders, bunches of 20s, great fish.
Right.
The
20
biggest,
inches, not 20 pounders.
yeah.
clarify.
It just
I was like, I'm going to Independence.
Yeah, these Minnesota guys, you got to watch them.
But funny thing, one fish can't, out of probably 3 years doing this hardcore
Right.
with that little window of time, one fish ended up on the wall. It was a 10-pounder that Ronnie G caught on the very last leech
Shout
in
out
the
to Ronnie
bucket.
G.
Hey, Ronnie G, what up?
How's Ronnie G?
I don't know. Kenny G's brother? I don't know.
No, it's Ronnie. It's Ronnie G. I learned a lot from Ronnie G.
Oh, jeez.
Anyway, last little nub of a leech. He said it was a baby. I wasn't with him when
Yeah.
he caught it. Last leech in the bucket.
Yeah.
It was right when the sun was going down. 10-pounder.
Yeah.
So why do you always go for the bigger leech then?
Because we caught plenty on the bigger leeches.
See, and that's the point, I think, is this
To
whole
me, I don't
conversation.
thi-
Does
I
it
think-
matter?
I don't
Does
think it
really
matters
matter?
on leeches.
Does it matter in leeches? Okay,
I
but
don't
here's what I do think it matters. And I don't care what anybody says. I'll go to my grave with this because I just catch a ton of fish on it. I only use small pieces of crawler. When I jig, or if I'm going to do a jig head and a piece of crawler with no plastic, it is a half a crawler or less. I mean, I have seen guys ball them up on that hook.
I've seen them double.
Yeah, I mean, it's just nuts, the amount of just flesh that goes up on that hook. And I can't do it. I mean, and not only that, but you could put a whole worm on a hook, fish it all day, and be lucky if you get 2 bites. The second you split that bad boy in half and you use, either the tail or the head,
I
you're
think
hammering
we
them.
we use predominantly half crawlers too. I'd say 95% of the time, but I think it's more of a scent thing. When you
could be.
cut that crawler in half,
Yeah.
I mean it's just scent everywhere.
Well, if you just
And
pinched
can
off
control-
a half inch of the tail and you still have a 7-inch crawler, it's still too much. It's just, they're down there looking at
they're
a
going
damn
to tail
snake.
nip you. And that's
Yeah.
that's the problem, especially if there's perch in the water.
Well, and that's the other big issue. But I mean, I'm telling you, half crawler. A half crawler with a jig head can be the most deadly presentation on the
it
planet.
really is. Yeah.
I mean, and I don't even use a
And
jig head
plus-
with color, just a plain lead head jig head,
And plus, you get twice the crawlers.
and you at least,
you go.
Dozen,
yeah.
2 dozen. I can
Yeah.
add 2 dozen, it'd be 4 dozen.
Yeah, well, that is
Yeah.
that right there is Nebraska Public Schools.
That's right there.
That's right.
Shout out to Nebraska Public Schools. See how smart I am? Okay, I stop after
Yeah,
that.
yeah, that's
I don't
true.
know
You know
if 4
the-
dozen.
yeah.
How many?
Yeah.
I think this kind of gets into just like color. Was it the fish just happened to be there?
Preference.
And it was the perfect
Right,
setup. And
right.
it didn't matter if it was big or small, it was going to eat it.
The water clarity, the cloud cover. I mean, there's all that stuff.
Yeah.
But the question really goes down to, and we've talked about it, and we'll talk about it for the rest of the time that we do this. It's the confidence. If you like big creek chubs in the spring on a Lindy rig or a slip bobber, and you have a certain size, you're going to go in the bait store and say, hey, Billy, I want the 2.5-inch creek chubs and make sure they're all close.
Yeah, and do you mind if I dig out the blue creekers?
Yeah.
I want the blue creekers.
But I mean, that's what you're going to do. You're going to be really specific. As to where the guy might come in there, hand him the bucket, and he gets those ones, where you get ripped off and it's like a 1/2 inch, and you're thinking, come on, dude. And you get the other ones that are, 5-6 inches, and you're thinking, golly, look at this. This thing's a 2-course meal. So I think that's the difference, right?
Okay, real quick, talking size, explain this. You're number 7 flicker shad, and you catch like an 8-inch walleye. What was he thinking?
Well, that's true. I mean, we've seen him do it on the flicker minnows.
Yeah.
Where they, you're looking at this thing going, the treble hook is stuck in his mouth. Like, I have a hard time unhooking him because the top hook is connected with the bottom hook, right?
The bait's almost as long as the
I don't know. I mean,
Um,
it's just because I think they just get, just get nuts. They get
Well,
ravenous.
they're all crazy.
Yeah,
Yeah, well, it's crazy. The reason I even
those are the female fish.
Well, the reason I even thought of that was a great example. My biggest pike I've ever caught was ice fishing, and
12.5 inches.
no, it was 40. It was
Teasing.
40.
I'm teasing. I know it's 40.
But again, in real shallow water, clear, I saw it. All of a sudden, my buddy goes, "Dude, look at this! Look
Yeah.
down the hole." You look down the hole, and there's a log laying underneath the house. We were just
Yeah.
packing up to go home. Well, I was set up for trout. I had a micro jig and 1 salmon egg on the little teeny hook.
Yeah.
And I was like, no guts, no glory.
Right.
I reeled up even with his yapper and jigged it twice, and he just snapped at it.
Yeah.
Just like if it was a bug or something small. So opportunistic. It was there. He snapped on it, and off we went, back and forth. He got that fish, but, I mean, really? Why would he eat something so small? Because it was right there.
It was
easy.
I think fish in general are opportunistic feeders. I think, a lot of guys will do these, you'll see them posted on social media where they have a camera and you can see the bait. Usually it's a crankbait or some sort of swim bait behind the camera. And you see that, these fish, all of a sudden they appear out of nowhere and it is an opportunistic strike. And they come up and they maybe follow it for a second, they strike. If they miss, they're gone. If they don't, you fish on.
No, you're right. You're
and
right.
so, because, you'll see guys that, and we've had guys win tournaments, and they're not even using entire pieces of a minnow. They're using a creek chub head.
Well, we do that, jigging.
Yeah.
This is open water. This is underneath a slip bobber, where it's just a chunk
dead
of
bait.
dead meat hanging below a slip bobber. And they'll win tournaments on that kind of garbage. And so, you're thinking, geez. So I think it's opportunistic. They're cruising through.
I think there's times that are opportunistic. If that was the case, everybody would be catching fish. You still got to get the right presentation.
I think it just weighs your odds in the right direction.
Right.
So, you're sure the flukes are going to happen, the 8-inch,
Right.
walleye trying to eat a flicker shad.
Right.
And the 40-inch pike eating a micro jig.
Right.
It's going to happen,
Right.
but the more you can kind of match it and kind of
Be consistent with what you're doing.
Right.
Really, it's paying attention to what's working and not being afraid to change. It's just like the jig thing that I was talking about, is if you're using white and it's working, and your buddy's using yellow and yellow's not working, he should be switching to white. Or he should try something different to see if orange is working better, and then you start
Right.
then you start figuring it out for the day. It's going to change every day.
Right.
But as far as the bait size, I think that you always got to be consistent with how you do your approach.
Yeah.
Right? You can't go, you can go out in the spring, consistent, just a perfect example, casting shorelines in the spring right after ice out or after post spawn. You're going to use the bigger baits. Now, could you get a fluke if you're casting number 4 flicker shad? Sure.
Sure.
Right? But I think when you're using those big stick baits, that's what I'm talking about being consistent. You know that that's predominantly what's going to work.
Right.
So consistency throughout the year is going to win the marathon.
But you're not, the consistency comes with the presentation consistency.
It does.
The part of you that's consistent is how you present it. You may only have a creek chub head on the bottom of that slip bobber rig, but the slip bobber is set at the perfect depth.
That's just it. That's true.
So
that's true. You're right.
You have the
But
you
that's
have
the consistency I'm
right,
talking
but you've
about.
got the
If you're
3-inch
fishing-
you've got the 3-inch grub tipped with a hunk of night crawler. All right, but you're consistently fishing it in the right zone, right? If you're pitching up to shore and they're biting it in 2 feet of water,
Vertical jigging,
or
whatever.
vertical, whatever. But that is where these podcasts and the stuff that we try to help with is so important, because it's developing all those other pieces to where you can narrow it down to, I wonder if it is a bigger leech. But you have all the other pieces of that puzzle so much, fairly in order enough to be able to give yourself that opportunity to say,
Your options.
yeah, is it color today, or is it the 4-inch leech instead of the 2-inch leech, or whatever? So I think that's the important piece, is it's the consistency to do the right presentation.
Yeah. No, I think we all agree with that. And that's something that everybody should take
Sure.
away. Hey, so I think we're going to wrap it up here tonight. First of all, we'd like to thank everybody for listening to us, but also make sure you're following us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And
Our webpage, alleyesonfishing.com.
Hey, and if you're this is the first podcast you've listened to, go back, listen to a bunch of others.
Yeah.
We'd love to hear about it too.
Yep.
and shoot us a comment, either on social media,
Yep.
or we also have our email. It's alleyesonfishing@gmail.com. We get a lot of people sending us information on that. Yeah, you're more than welcome to do the same thing.
Absolutely, yep. And don't forget, like and share, because that's how we get out to more people, more fishermen, and more topics for us to discuss with you guys.
All right, guys. Thanks a lot.
This has been All Eyes on Fishing. Thank you for joining us. Join us again next time, where we discuss all of your favorite fishing topics. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Check out our videos on YouTube, or read our blog at alleyesonfishing.com. All Eyes on Fishing, leading you to the next level.